Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this event looking at extreme heat events and their impacts and adaptation solutions in the face of extreme heat. My name is Radley Horton. I'm a climate scientist here at Columbia. And this event tonight is being put on by Columbia's Adaptation Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is a 3-year effort where we're really trying to bring different parts of the university together, making sure that our physical science components are interacting with all the people thinking about impacts on society and various solutions, sort of recognizing that a lot of the sort of grand challenges that we're going to face in the future really are going to require all the disciplines that we have here at Columbia, but also beyond, out in civil society. And I think this panel today is going to reflect some of those broader dialogues that we need to have as we think about resilience into the future. So I co-chair this adaptation initiative along with Lisa Goddard, who's listed as being supposed to open this event, but she couldn't be here tonight. So the Adaptation Initiative has hosted several public events of this type and also flag a conference that we're going to be hosting next June on managed retreat, basically thinking about solutions that may actually involve having to move out of harm's way in some context. So that's something to keep an eye out for. But for tonight's event, we're going to hone in on extreme heat events. This time of year, especially, I think we're all tending to think about cool season events, fall storms, winter storms, flooding, maybe even rain like we'll see this weekend. But it's important to keep in mind that in the typical year, extreme heat is the biggest killer and has a range of really severe public health impacts, infrastructure impacts that we're going to learn a lot more about tonight. And a lot of those, unfortunately, tend to focus on our most vulnerable populations and sometimes enhance some pre-existing disparities and inequalities. So we'll learn more about that during this panel too. And to bring us this perspective, it's great because we're going to have private sector, NGO, and sort of nonprofit perspectives. So, since we have this great August panel, I want to get out of the way. Gavin Schmidt, director of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, is going to moderate our discussion. He's promised that he's going to interject with his perspective throughout, which is great as well. Now you have to.
Pressure.
So we'll have about 45 minutes for this discussion, then we'll have 10 minutes or so for your questions. And I encourage you all to stick around afterward for some informal discussion and for some cocktails and snacks as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you already. I had to correct one thing you said. This is not an August event. This is October. Really? a mild grimace would have been sufficient. Thank you very much. Okay, my name is Gavin Schmidt. I'm the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is a NASA lab which is just off Columbia campus, where we work on climate simulations and climate observations and climate impacts. And I'd love to talk to you at length about all of the wonderful things that we do, but I am merely the moderator, so we're actually very fortunate to have 4 very interesting and diverse group of people in terms of what they do, where they come from, and what they think about in terms of this the extreme heat issue, and they're going to be much more interesting than me. So, with very little further ado, I'd actually like just to ask each of you to very briefly introduce yourself, where you're from, what your interest in this particular topic is, and then we'll just take it from there. I've got some questions to get us going, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. There will be plenty of time for questions from the audience towards the end, and so if you have something very burningly important that you have to say, kind of write it down so that you can say it extremely succinctly and as a question and not as a comment. That would be appreciated. But we will get around to hopefully everything that people want to to talk about. Let's start all the way at the end. Kitty.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Kizzy Charles-Guzman.
Sorry, gosh.
I am the Deputy Director for Social Resiliency at the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. And my team developed and is working to implement the Cool Neighborhoods NYC strategy, which is the city's first heat adaptation strategy.
Bob Haas. Get a little closer. Bob Haas. I work with a company called Radiant Solutions, a private industry. My background is actually in meteorology. We do products and services, which I lead for the trading community, specifically commodity traders, as well as energy, so utilities and oil and gas companies, as well as agriculture. That's kind of where we live, providing weather services historically, which has sort of translated more and more to climate services as well.
Okay, Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Marvel. I am an associate research scientist at NASA GISS and at Columbia's Department of Applied Physics and Math. I am a physicist by training, and I'm interested in the physics of the climate system. I'm also really interested in how we communicate climate science and how we talk about climate change.
Peggy.
Good evening. I'm Peggy Shepard, Executive Director of We Act for Environmental Justice. We are an organization that works to organize residents to engage in environmental decision-making, and we have spent a couple of years developing a Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan and engaging 400 community residents who are working in two working groups, one around climate resilience and emergency preparedness, and another around healthy homes, to ensure that we prioritize energy security and that we begin to address some of the issues that are very common in vulnerable communities like Northern Manhattan neighborhoods.
Great. So let me first start off by asking, what do you think of when you think of extreme heat? What does that mean to you, both in terms of like kind of definitionally, but also in terms of the impacts? And I'm going to ask Kate first, and then go back to well, actually no, we'll go to Peggy after that, and then Bob and Kizzy.
Oh, that's not fair to start with me, because there actually isn't a precise scientific definition of heat wave that we can use to be sort of the one definition of heat wave. And I think that's really an interesting question, because it highlights a really important point, which is that all of this stuff really needs to be two-way. It can't be scientists just sort of making pronouncements from on high and kind of expecting our advice to be followed. I think we really need to be listening to what matters about heat extremes.
So, Peggy, tell me what matters about heat extremes. That's a great lead-in.
Well, one thing that matters is that we're not prepared. And we know that we're going to face uncomfortably high temperatures during the summer every year, whether we're ready for it or not. And some communities are simply not ready. And I'm not sure that the city's cooling centers is the solution to the challenge. We've had 30 sweltering summer days with 90-plus degree temperatures, starting as early as May this year, with 51 weather advisories. Heat and air quality advisories during the summer means that people with pre-existing health conditions like asthma struggle to breathe. High temperature and humidity days make underground subway stations unbearable, and cooling centers should be readily available in adequate condition and abundant in communities like Northern Manhattan neighborhoods.
Great. So I will add that from New York City, we define a heat wave as any time that the heat index is forecast to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit for any duration, or 95 degrees on 2 days or more. So that is absolutely right, as Peggy's mentioned, and we've had a lot of what we would consider to be extreme heat days and a lot of periods that we would consider to be heat waves. And the reason we're concerned about them is because, of course, as you have heard, more New Yorkers and actually more Americans die from heat waves than any other natural disaster combined. And here in New York City, that means about 13 people on average on every summer, but that's from heat stroke deaths, right? So that's directly linked to heat. That's what it says in their death certificate. But we're also worried about what we consider excess heat deaths, right, or excess deaths from heat, which means that these are people that die because their pre-existing health condition has been made worse, has been exacerbated by heat. So folks with cardiovascular disease or renal disease or respiratory illnesses tend to be part of that. And we see about 115 people dying every summer on average, more or less. We also see a lot of emergency department visits, 450 on average per year. And what that means is that it's a significant health impact, and that we do see it concentrated in certain populations and in certain neighborhoods. So some neighborhoods in the city of New York are more vulnerable to heat than others, but there are vulnerable populations within every single neighborhood, if that makes sense. So the elderly, those with, again, compromised cardiovascular systems or respiratory systems, those that live in poverty and don't have access to air conditioning, that kind of thing. So certainly we think of heat as a significant equity and environmental justice problem.
Bob?
Yeah, so my answer a little bit different, just from my angle. Certainly, at a personal or human level, I certainly very much respect all of those sorts of impacts. For our customers in the private industry, what really is kind of confusing to them is the changing normals. So a lot of our customers in the trading community basically understand what should be normal weather, and they know how to respond to that. But when there become just regular types of extremes, it really changes the mindset of how to deal with certain situations. So when we talk about summers over the past 10 to 15 years being 10% or so warmer than the summers on average from 1980 to 2010, things like that are what really drive changes in behavior of how they use our products and how we respond to them, and actually ultimately have to change how we portray our forecasts and things like that over time. So a little bit different angle, but very much still lots of influence. Looking specifically a little bit at a couple of the markets for energy, the amount of demand increasing through the summer, very relevant to our customers. On the ag side, how much heat stress combined with drought could be on the crops in the Midwest at any given summer. Thinking back to 2012, for instance, how horrible that was. Those types of things are what is really forefront, and what's talked about in terms of heat extremes in my space.
So there were a lot of interesting things there. I'd like to follow up a little bit. So we've all read stories about the massive mortality toll from like big heat waves in Europe, right? So in 2003 there was a massive heat wave in France, Switzerland, Spain area, and tens of thousands of people prematurely died because of that. So have we had anything like that here in the US? I'm pretty sure we haven't had anything like that in New York, but in the US, have we seen that, or are we anticipating? At what point would we get to such a stage? Hopefully never, right?
I think there was a Chicago incident, correct?
Right, in 95.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there was a few hundred people that died in a very short amount of time. I think it was.
And again, in New York, right? Because by the time you're actually counting all of this excess mortality that comes after and during extreme heat events, we have this every single summer. The stats I gave you are our annual figures, okay? It's an average annual figure. So take the 2006 heat wave in New York, 140 people died. In 2013, we had 160 people, and those were the excess deaths. So, no, these are not thousands of people the way that, Paris had experienced. Right. But for us, right, it is a significant hazard because every single one of those deaths were preventable, right? So the health department did an analysis, for example, of all the heat stroke deaths between 2000 and 2013, I want to say, and all of them were exposed at home. So these people died at home. So we tend to have this idea that it's the homeless population that's at greatest risk, or outdoor workers, or people that are out there jogging. But it's not. It's happening inside apartments with people that do not have access to air conditioning, and there's very little media attention around that.
Right. Because it's not, yes, it's
It's
happening
hard to
at
go into people's homes,
Yeah.
That's right.
So Bob, is there a disconnect then between the kind of signals that the market sees in terms of the costs and impacts of heat waves and the actual toll on individual lives? I mean, presumably that I'm guessing people aren't making huge multi-million bets on those kinds of things.
I mean, they're not looking at the statistics that they're not looking at is how many people are dying. The statistics that they're looking at is how much is load growth year on year and things like that, specifically dependent on summertime temperatures. So that's more of how they may look at how Texas heat changes year to year. Okay, sure, some of that is accounted for by growing renewables and things like that, but to them, it's also trying to better wrap their heads around. I mentioned the kind of what is normal concept. As normal continues to change and become warmer and warmer, it's a very much a change in mentality. In the past 10 years, for instance, we've had people that historically have looked at our products and services compared to a standard 30-year normal, and now that's just kind of getting to the point of irrelevancy, at least in terms of summer.
Right.
So.
Right. Can you give me a ballpark figure of all the impacts that make an economic impact in your area? Where are the biggest impacts in the urban areas economically, in terms of lost work or lost productivity, or is it in the rural areas associated with agriculture or some other kind of industry?
It's probably both in some way. I mean, the agriculture, like you said, is going to be your more rural areas. So, that does get very much into impacting humans if crops are not faring as well over an area over an entire season. Right. On the energy side, it tends to be the big cities. So if there's big heat consistently, more and more so in the big cities, that's what's going to be most critical to them. Yeah.
So Peggy, so let's get back to what happens in the big cities. Now we know that it isn't just the meteorological conditions that affect the heat in the cities, but also the urban environment, right? So we know that there's an urban heat island effect that varies across the city. I mean, people will know that if you go into the park during a hot summer day, it's cooler than if you're walking down Broadway, and there's a lot of variation across the city in the actual temperatures that people are experiencing. So do you want to go in a little bit there about how that actually works out?
So there's incredible variability in neighborhoods between blocks, depending on the built environment. We did a study with a couple of small institutes at CUNY a couple of years ago, and we put heat sensors, some folks from Columbia put heat sensors into 40 of our members' apartments. And one thing we found, for instance, if you had a 90-degree day and in the daytime and it went down to, I don't know, say 60 at night, in people's apartments, that 90 degrees maintained for several days. So it never reduced as it reduced outside. And some of that is because of the built environment, the way that building may be constructed. Right. And we also know that 72% of households in northern Manhattan are cost burdened and have lack of access to air conditioning. So you would think, well, people are dying in their homes. Why is that happening? Why aren't they turning on the air conditioning? 72% don't have them. We've got another 72,000 people with disabilities or limited mobility, unable to really live independently, so they stay at home. Why don't they go to a cooling center? They may not be able to, by themselves, go down the street or a few blocks or wherever that center may be. And as we know, a lot of senior citizens are very, nervous or paranoid about going to strange places or leaving their homes. So again, you've got a vulnerable population that has no access to air conditioning. Sometimes people do have access, but don't turn it on because they can't afford the energy bill. And that's part of the energy insecurity that we're seeing as well, that can be addressed in a number of ways.
That's great.
I wanted to add, if I may,
Yeah.
that again, Peggy, absolutely right. There's so much variation, even block to block in the same neighborhood, and it's all really predicated by the built environment, right? So drivers include dark pavements, the dark roofs, the building material, right? We all love these glass buildings. These glass buildings are creating a greenhouse effect in the city, right? Other buildings tend to absorb that heat and not release it as fast as they could, right? So that's thermal inertia for that building. So it contributes to the scenario where it's very hard for the apartments to cool down in the evening hours, right? If you've had very high heat during the day. We also see that a lack of vegetation, a lack of impervious surfaces, all of those things that would have normally put in a lot of moisture in the air, right? Evapotranspiration, and that would have had a cooling effect at the local level. Neighborhoods that have less of those environmental amenities also have higher surface temperatures.
Can
So
you be
it's-
more specific? Like what neighborhoods that we would know have more of a problem with this than which ones don't?
So working with Columbia University's Maitland School of Public Health, the city's health department researchers there developed what we call the Heat Vulnerability Index. And this is a study, so you can just Google that, you'll come across it. And it was looking at what were those risk factors, physical and social, right, that increase heat vulnerability at the local scale. So settled on 4 indicators that are driving this, right? And so when you look at the map, you end up with communities in central Brooklyn, in northern Manhattan, and in the South Bronx as being highly vulnerable to heat. So there are quintiles, and that would be the most high heat vulnerable areas. And then other parts of the city, which you would expect. So actually, surprisingly, a lot of this is driven by a lack of vegetation, right? And we don't have a lot of space in the city to move around or a lot of soil. The areas that are closer to parks tend to be a little bit cooler, but then they might also have more traffic, or they might have more sources of what we call waste heat, including that protruding air conditioning in the back, right? So there are just very many factors that contribute to these like pockets of a high temperature at the local scale. So it's also why it's a hard problem to solve.
I think that's a really interesting point, because that kind of illustrates how these physical changes on a really large scale interact with the built environment and changes on really small scales. So one of the kind of smoking guns of climate change, one of the reasons that we know that it's us, it's carbon dioxide, is the fact that nights are warming just as faster than days. And that, I believe, is one of the biggest contributors to mortality. If you don't get a break, if it doesn't cool down at night, that can be very, very dangerous. And so that, to me, is the sort of crystal clear illustration of the fact that climate change doesn't happen on a hypothetical planet. Climate change happens in the world that we've built for it.
That's right.
Do you want to follow up with, what are the other things that are associated with extreme heat that also perhaps having another impact? I mean, I'm thinking air quality issues, maybe not so much in New York, but out west, fires. There's an increased amount of smoke in the air. Some of the air quality situations in the summer in Edmonton and in Vancouver were like off the charts in terms of their bad health effects. So that isn't an issue so much in New York, but maybe Bob. I mean, have you looked into like these kind of ancillary issues that are associated with heat but aren't directly heat?
Yeah, some of the ones you named, not as directly, but even things like the likelihood of stronger summer storms around the periphery of it, and an even more aggressive ridge than what might typically be seen, looking at more weather forecasting at that sense than climate. But really, you look back to a year like 2012, that's one that kind of I had noted to kind of talk a little bit about. That was a really bad year for agriculture in the Midwest. But it was also the year that in June we had sort of the derecho, right, that came through the Midwest and through the Mid-Atlantic. It was in that July that we had a very, very extreme heat wave, perhaps the hottest month since 1950, really across North America. So a lot of what I look at is actually the more broad, what is it doing across the U.S. Than one small area. But there are absolutely these other impacts. And you mentioned the night times. that this summer was very, this past summer, so June through August, the way that we kind of, frame things, the summertime minimums absolutely drove a great deal more, energy demand, and did at times cause more crop stress and things like that. So.
Do you want to talk a little bit about attribution of these kind of one-off, seemingly extreme storm or wind events?
Me or?
Yes.
Sure. So it can be actually very difficult to attribute rare events because they are by definition rare, and so you don't have a lot of them, and it's hard to sort of pick out trends in them. You mentioned the 2003 heat wave in Europe, and that was really kind of a watershed for climate science attribution because that was one of the first single events that there was a very, very clear signal of anthropogenic climate change. That heat wave was made more than twice as likely by the presence of anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so for a really long time, you kind of heard this sort of drumbeat of, well, you can't ever attribute any single event to climate change. And that's kind of changing now. We can talk about things like what we call the fraction of attributable risk. This is how much climate change increased the risk of that particular event. So heat waves are one of the things that we are actually the most confident in. We are the most confident that climate change is going to increase the occurrence of heat waves. And there's just very basic, simple physics underlying that. It can get a little bit more difficult when you're talking about how climate change will affect the severity of any individual heat wave, because that's a function of sort of air currents moving around at very small scales. So when you get to talking about the sort of magnitude of any given heat event, that becomes a little bit more complicated. But fundamentally, I like to think about event attribution the way I think about Lance Armstrong. So Lance Armstrong, it makes sense. Hold on.
Okay.
So Lance Armstrong
okay.
is very good at riding his bike. He would beat me in any given bike race, and he would probably win a bunch of Tour de France even if he wasn't doping. But he was doping, and we know what doping does. Now, we don't say, well, Lance Armstrong was doping, so maybe in that race he would have come third, so let's give him third prize. And in that race he would have come 62nd, so let's give him 62nd prize. That's not the way that we think about that. We say, we know you were doping, and we know what doping does. And therefore, we feel confident in stripping you of your titles. I think of event attribution much the same way. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to say, well, climate change made this particular event 5 times more likely, and climate change made this other particular event 18 times more likely. For me, it's exactly the same. We know that we are doping the weather, and we know what climate change does. And so that's the way that, we know what climate change does, and that's the way that I like to think about these things. So I told you it would make sense.
Okay,
I like
perfect.
that. Yeah.
Perfect.
I want to clap for that.
Which actually brings us round to one of the other big questions that I think Peggy and Kizzy have worked with, and Kate and Bob as well, of course. The issue of communication, right? How do you communicate all of the different messages that are going on? So so you have like the acute message, like it's going to be hot today, you need to be doing something, and then there's the kind of somewhat longer term, like here are the things that you can do to make yourself more resilient to heat stress, and then there's the communication of what's going on, what should we expect in the future, and those are all different levels to different people and with different strategies. So I'd like to know what works for the kinds of things that you want to be communicating to your audience. What are you finding to be effective, and what are you finding that isn't effective that perhaps we could learn from? Peggy.
I'm not sure I can answer the question quite that way, but I would say that in talking to some of the residents who participated in our study, some of them wanted to be able to call 311 and report that someone was having difficulty because of heat. Some people have suggested that just as landlords are mandated to turn on heat on October 15th or a date similar to that, that there's a point perhaps when landlords must provide cooling. I would think that it might be a good idea in our building code to say that all new construction needs to have a cooling room on the premises. So I think there are a number of ways we could think out of the box about this situation. And I think that, it would be great to have a buddy system. When we were organizing around this issue, what we found most was that people were most concerned about the lack of social cohesion. We have people living in buildings where 5, 6, 7 different languages might be spoken, which often means that those people aren't speaking together, that those people can't or may not be buddies to each other, to check on each other if there's a particular problem, or they might know that there's a disabled person in the building. I know when we were talking to the New York City Housing Authority about this issue, some tenants had the idea that, well, why don't we do a registry of everyone in the building who has a disability or vulnerability, so that there's some sort of tenant volunteer system that could then contact those people and check on them. And NYCHA said, well, we wouldn't want to do that because those vulnerable people could be preyed upon and exploited if there's some sort of public registry in the building.
That's right.
So, we really have to think about how we can begin to address these issues. Should everyone be given an air conditioner? Do we have to subsidize the energy costs for those air conditioners? How would that work? We also need to think about the outdoor workers. About 30% of the 1,000 people we surveyed in northern Manhattan had jobs that required them to work outside. We haven't really talked about workers outside in the heat. And so what happens in terms of worker occupational safety and health when there's a certain heat level and they've been outdoors in that heat for a large amount of time. So these are all questions that I don't know that we've begun to address or resolve.
Kizzy? Yeah.
I'll add that, so this communication issue is really important. There are so many messages, and there are so many messengers, if that makes sense, and not all of them are trusted messengers. So what's happening is, so back in 2010 and 11, the city conducted surveys and a focus group, a telephone survey and also focus groups, to try to understand heat behavior in New York City. We do have a very robust network of cooling centers, and they're grossly underutilized. And we needed to understand, what do we need to be doing differently, and why are this many people not heeding the advice, right? Like not taking the charge of staying safe during hot weather. And we saw a couple of things. Number one, a lot of people that self-reported having fair or poor health, so and didn't have access to air conditioning or didn't use it. So we would consider them at risk, right? Vulnerable. They said they didn't use air conditioners because they didn't like it. They said, absolutely, that cost was a concern, but that wasn't the primary concern. They simply did not like the feel of air conditioning. We heard from people that said, I'm from Cameroon, I'm from Haiti, that's hot, this ain't hot, right? So the idea that this life-saving device, right, is what we're telling people, you have to get to a cool place, right, is the thing that's going to keep them safe, it wasn't quite resonating. So that was one thing. They didn't like it. Secondly, we were saying, why aren't you going to cooling centers? I prefer to stay home. Well, but if it's dangerously hot indoors, why do you want to stay home? I just want to stay home. Is it because you can't bring your pet to a cooling center? No, nothing to do with the pet. Fifi's all right. I just like to be home. Yeah. And so again, we're also trying to get into this culture piece of people just hunkering down, right? We have a hard time evacuating people. You have seen it all over the news, even when the hurricane is at our door, right? Much less with something that we don't perceive to be a real health risk. And I think that heat is one of those things. We don't perceive the risk of dying from heat to be very real. Another thing is that people didn't quite perceive that they were old. They were like, I am vulnerable, right? So they could be 1,000 years old and they don't think that they are the ones that are personally at risk. So that was also interesting. It just gives us a sense, right, of like human perception and like our own ability to weather these storms, or in this case, weather the heat wave. So that was one thing that we learned. Another thing that we learned is that we were actually given confusing messages. So for example, when you look at the news during extreme heat events, you see that normally the weather forecaster or the health or medical reporter would tell you something like, stay indoors, or drink water and check on your neighbors and all those things. But the images they're showing you are about people jogging outside, or people in parks, or people bathing at the beach. So there is an image that is a disconnect there, because when you look at who actually dies and who actually goes to the emergency department and who actually is seriously at risk from heat illness, it's actually older adults that are exposed indoors. It's not young people or even children that are jogging outside. And so part of it is that we weren't doing a good job of presenting, as reporters, right, presenting the right image to allow people who don't think that they're vulnerable to see themselves on TV, right? So I think that that's really important. So it's part of why the city strategy now, as much as we want to focus a lot of attention and intention on the cooling center network, it's actually about reaching New Yorkers inside their homes. I know I'm going on a very long time, but I'm on my soapbox, so you have to bear with it. Right? We have to get to those trusted messengers. So we developed heat resiliency training that is focused on heat risk and protective actions that you can take to stay safe during periods of hot weather, right? And we're doing that round with meteorologists, with the weather reporters, with health services providers, with community-based organizations that then employ community health workers, with home health aides. And the reason we're doing that is because if they're not listening to that one press conference or to that one, who else are they listening to? And the answer is the people that care for them and that are visiting those most vulnerable individuals every day. That would normally be a home health aide. That would be their doctor, their pharmacist. So I think that the communication piece is so critical. And so we're trying to get there by reaching New Yorkers inside their homes while also trying to make some investments on the cooling center network.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, so I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier, the question of what is normal, but now provide a little bit more context to that. Some of the challenges that have really arisen in communication of that is, I'll break it down to what we call population-weighted cooling degree days. Basically, it measures, here we go, weather guy, right? Population-weighted cooling degree days. Why that's important, it's based on population. We take about 200 cities across the U.S. And what it really means, as we say that population-weighted cooling degree days are skyrocketing, is that it's getting hotter, particularly in the places that people live. And 10 years ago, if I were to go to one of our oil and gas companies and, say, throw up a slide that says, this is climate change, I would have been kind of booed out of the room. Over the years, I started to call some of my slide titles climate drift and then climate change. And it's become more and more accepted over the years that, hey, this thing is really real. I think the summers have been most responsible for people understanding that this thing is really real. Again, these population-weighted cooling degree days, the 5 hottest summers since 1950, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2016, and 2018, all since 2010.
Yeah.
What that's basically done to some of the communication and messaging from me to the customer is now to forecast a 10-year normal summer is a top 10 summer since 1950.
Yep.
The messaging behind that is just kind of wild and crazy now, to the point where, this summer, for instance, heading into the summer, we always make a preseason forecast. Our forecast was for the 7th hottest summer since 1950. It turned out to be 4th. And, decent forecast, perhaps, but making a forecast at a long lead that seems kind of normal, but is ultimately now extreme, has become just a very strange way to communicate a message.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the front page of the New York Times for 3 years in a row saying that this was the warmest year ever.
Yep.
Right. So I totally understand like the
Yeah.
whole weirdness thing about that.
Yeah.
That's not normal.
No, not
Okay,
normal.
Kate, tell us about communication.
So I'll talk about communication not from sort of an acute perspective, but from kind of a large, like this is happening perspective. So we have a measurement called wet bulb temperature, which is literally if you have a thermometer and you stick it in the air, you measure the dry bulb temperature. If you wrap a wet washcloth around that thermometer, you measure something called the wet bulb temperature. And so if the air is really, 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 really humid, then it doesn't matter that you've put that wet cloth around it. So basically the wet bulb temperature is a measure of a combination of heat and humidity. And so we can communicate that by saying we expect the wet bulb temperature to increase in the future. And you hear that and you're like, all right, that's kind of boring. I don't really care about that. We could say the wet bulb temperature matters because if it gets too high, then it impedes the human body's ability to cool itself down by sweating, which is our natural biological defense. And now that sounds a little bit more interesting and you're more intrigued. But if we say, if the wet bulb temperature exceeds 95 degrees, then you, a healthy young person, even if you're in the shade, with no clothes on, you'll be dead in 6 hours. And that is much, much more effective, I think. And you know, that has incredible implications for people who work outside.
What are your average wet bulb temperatures now for this summer? What were we seeing?
Probably it depends on where you are, the 70s. In the Chicago heat wave, we saw most of the mortality when the wet bulb temperature was about 85, 86. So, but the point is that just talking about numbers, just using charts, which is what we're trained to do as scientists, doesn't really change any minds. What we really need to do is A, listen, we can't just talk, and B, we need to figure out ways to communicate these numbers in terms of stories, in terms of things that people relate to as human beings.
Okay, so talking about listening as opposed to talking, we have about 15 minutes now, and we'll take some questions from the floor. So think about your questions and put your hands up if you have one. But as the moderator's perspective, I'm going to ask everybody like for a very short answer on. What should we do? What can we do as individuals, as perhaps homeowners, and as citizens to minimize the impacts of these things, either locally or globally? Peggy.
Well, I think we need a public service campaign, whether it's bus shelters, subway ads, and television public service announcements, so that we can really raise the visibility to everyone, not just to the most vulnerable, but to also those of us who know some of those most vulnerable people who are in our buildings or in our lives or in our families. I think the first thing we have to do is understand that heat is a killer.
Yeah. Okay.
From the mitigation perspective, the most important thing you can do is vote, and tell your friends and your family to vote as well.
Bob.
I guess I don't have, this is more the personal perspective than the, as
That's
a private.
totally valid.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is just to, tell people that this thing is real and that we can do some things about it, right? Climate change is not going to go away unless everyone really cooperates. And I think to Kate's point, it is part of picking who our leadership is and things like that will actually spend the money necessary to try to help combat this and participate globally and things like that. So. Again, more personal than my as a Radiant, but
don't apologize for that.
Yeah.
Kizzy.
I think that the best thing each of us can do is to be a buddy to someone in your building, to someone in your family, to your friends, to your neighbors. There's the perception that, oh, New Yorkers, we're all just renting here and passing through. Get to know your neighbors. These lists of vulnerable people won't materialize. There are a lot of privacy concerns. No one thinks that they're vulnerable. They don't want to be on some list. But I know in which floor Mrs. Smith is living, and I make it a point to knock on her door and say, hey, it's hot this week. Do you need some water? Is there anything I can do? Right? And so being a buddy to someone, it's not just older adults, as people with mental health conditions, because the medicines they take impede their body's ability to feel as hot as they should be, or to feel like they should be drinking water, right? So we all know somebody that has cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory illnesses, and mental health conditions, someone who drinks too heavily. You all know these people. Text them, check on them, offer help.
Hi, so none of you mentioned cool roofs, planting trees, like less concrete, having people ventilate their apartments at night and keep it dark during the day. I read a book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez once that mentioned that as a really important thing for Colombia. So that should be valid here too, right?
Yeah.
Yes, but you didn't mention any of those things, right? So are they not important, or are they unchangeable, or can we not make a contribution along those lines?
Oh gosh, can I please? Yes, all those things matter.
Good.
All those things are part of Cool Neighborhoods NYC, and planting trees is important, and it also takes 100 years to make a 100-year-old tree. Think about that. So the benefit of that tree, the incredible shade and full ecological benefit of that tree is going to take a minute to materialize. And because I keep telling you that people are dying every summer today, in the meantime, while those trees grow and while we get around painting the roofs white, check on your neighbors. It's the one thing you can do to help us all stay alive.
Okay, I'll throw in one more thing and then we'll go to questions. So Eliud Kipchoge, who is the winner of the Berlin Marathon, fastest man at the marathon distance like ever, he comes from Kenya, and one of the things that he often says is that the best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago.
That's right.
But the second best time to plant a tree is today.
Yes.
Right. So you would agree with that? Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. I like that one. Okay, so over to you. Yes.
Gavin, I wanted to follow
Somebody
up.
has a microphone.
Yeah,
already.
I wanted to follow up on your comment about solutions, and I wanted to address this to Kitty in particular.
Kizzy.
I'm sorry?
Kizzy.
Kizzy?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
That was my fault. I apologize.
So my thought is this, that a lot of older people who are on Social Security cannot afford an extra $150 a month for electricity to run an air conditioner. So the solution here, and keep in mind we have to use all solutions,
That's right.
is to have the building code changed so that firewell, stairwells, the windows can be opened, the doors to the stairwells can be opened, and the tenant's door can be opened, and the tenant's window is open. Therefore, we get cross ventilation. And it's a win-win in the sense that we're not creating more CO2 from running the air conditioner at the power plant. So reduces CO2, and I think we're at 410 now on our way to 450, which means we're in deep doo-doo in case anybody did not read the UN report. So Kitty, would you take that back to Mayor de Blasio? We've got to change the fire code, because if you had your hold on, Gavin, just give me a second. If your researchers, your students, your PhD students went around New York City and counted up the number of 6, 16, 24-story old buildings that you can do this ventilation. You just get the draft coming up.
Yeah.
It's very bloody simple, and I hope Mayor de Blasio and Kizzy take this on board.
Thank you very much. Okay, so there wasn't actually a question, so let's go to somebody who has an actual question. You know what? I'm going to choose somebody who isn't quite as eager. Like all the way at the back there, the lady at the back. Yes, you.
Hi.
I'll get you. Don't worry.
Sure. My question's about behavior change. Kizzy, you addressed it a little bit in terms of getting to the home health aides. So I'm wondering if, also Peggy, I'd love to hear what has been effective in actually reaching people, what kind of messages, work and have gotten people to act or participate in programs where, they check on their buddy system or they, look at their building. I'd love to hear examples.
Peggy?
Well, one of the issues that some of our members were thinking about was developing a kiosk that could be solar powered, so that in an emergency like an electrical shutoff could still be powered and could provide a range of information where a cooling center is, what they might do, if there's a number to call. In addition, some of my staff this past summer, much to my surprise, went around putting up their own homemade signs at key public housing units telling people where the nearest cooling center was. The problem with that turned out to be that they were looking at a list, and it turned out that some of those cooling centers actually weren't opened. So, So there are numbers of things that we can all try, and I think communication is just, we've got to figure out a communication system that really works. And, I'm noticing all of these kiosks that are now on the streets that have information, but they don't really have emergency information. And I've been trying to ask how we could make that happen, and I'm being told it's really complex, and, there are these vendors and all of this stuff.
But it doesn't seem an insurmountable problem, does it?
It doesn't seem like it should be, and now they seem to be everywhere.
Yeah.
And they're giving updates for the subways, so why would they not give updates for cooling centers and things like that? That seems like a very good idea.
Yeah. That sounds like a question, so I'm going to take that as a question from Gavin here. The cooling center network is not owned or operated by the City of New York. We only own and operate the public libraries. Other than that, there are health services or social service provider organizations, right? So senior centers, community spaces. The point is that they volunteer, they opt in to be a cooling center, and that condition will change heat wave to heat wave or summer to summer. You might have an organization that is no longer able to provide services as a cooling center because their AC broke, or because they went out of business, or because they relocated. There are many reasons why there isn't a permanent list of cooling centers.
But you don't need to have a permanent list, just like the subway, right? You have an updated list of where there are issues this weekend, today, right? So what's open today? All you need is to have those people actually just notify you, and then you spread it around.
You can absolutely get up-to-date information through 311 and using the city communication systems. They're not part of the link system yet,
right?
And I don't know why that is.
If we can get a tweet from the president, I think we can use the link system to give people information. Okay, I'm gonna. See, that's more like it.
Well,
that's more
go.
like it. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to try and alternate. I'm going to go the lady just here. Yep, you, and then you'll be next, and then you'll be next. Okay.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shepard, your information is extremely research-based and proactive and preventative. At least that's the preponderance of evidence that I received tonight. Have you looked in other cities where there's a pocket of heat that can be tracked, and to see exactly what they're doing and how they're doing to be more preventative in terms of deaths? In Houston, for instance, where it's really hot. Every senior citizen has access to a lot of the remedies that you spoke of. They can't be in a residential place if there's not air conditioning. And, you can Google it, but Houston is a place in Texas that makes sure that their citizens, if they're, in the over 60 game, are cool. Have you looked at that?
Great question.
I have not, and I do work with groups in Houston, so I will look into that. And I should also say that the research we do is generally in collaboration with the Mailman School of Public Health or with the city and other smaller research institutes. But I will definitely look at that Houston model, and I don't know if Kizzy has looked at other best practices in other cities or countries?
Yeah.
Maybe all over the state of Texas.
Okay.
My mother is 9 hours from Houston, and then her senior citizen, it's air conditioning has to be. The air conditioning goes on.
Right.
And
You raise a very good point, and the point is that when Houston was built, they already knew that it was going to be hot. When a lot of the places that are further north were built, they did not anticipate this. And so what we have here is a lot of legacy structures and legacy mechanisms that were not built for the conditions that we're either experiencing now or that we will be experiencing in the near future. And so there's a change, and and it's the change that's the cost, not necessarily the absolute temperature.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And again, back to the air conditioning piece, it's been really interesting to tell people that say that they don't like the feel of air conditioning or they don't like to use it. They're not used to it. They are homes growing up, never had it. When you tell them that they will stay safe indoors if the AC is turned to 78 degrees. Like, they always think of it as if it has to be 62. Yeah. And that's because you and I are used to being in these offices in the summertime, right? And like the women have all their coats on and the men are wearing three-piece suits, which is absolutely insane. So this idea of responsible air conditioning use is something that we absolutely should be looking at. Cities across the world don't do this, right? You have these huge buildings that are the true energy hogs and the real producers of the CO2 emissions. It's not Mrs. Smith baking on the 5th floor with her little window AC. That's the cause of the problem, right? But it's amazing when you often are able to communicate and get it through them that they don't get that clammy feeling if it's set to 78 degrees. They're saving money, so they don't see a jump in their electricity bill at $150 a month, right? Because you don't have to set it to 60 degrees.
Right. Yeah, you shouldn't. Okay, good. Yes.
Yeah,
can you use the mic, please? Thanks.
Since we've talked so much about air conditioners, I had a thought. First of all, from what I understand and what I've observed too, there's been great advances in compressor technology. Air conditioners are much, much more efficient than they used to be.
This is true.
And I imagine that 90% of the people in the city have very inefficient air conditioners, number one. Number two, and you go to Europe, air conditioners, they're inside, they're up on the top, so the heat comes down. I mean, the cool air comes down. Cool air comes down, excuse me. Yeah. So what I wondered is if New York City is looking into that, because I don't know how you would do it financially and so on, but if there was a relatively strong push toward replacing the equipment with newer equipment, situating it differently and so on, first of all, it would cut down energy use and the carbon dioxide emissions. It would make this stuff affordable for people and so on. I mean, I think the advance in compressor technology is very important, along with the LED technology. Those things can really, really help out.
Absolutely right. We are looking into that. Yep, absolutely.
Anything on the horizon for that?
I don't know that we would say it's in the horizon. Again, it's the idea of who's paying for this thing. But yes, newer, more efficient equipment exists, and it's the thing that we should be pursuing, especially as we retrofit existing buildings. I think, again, the problem is really not with the new buildings. It's about what we do with this ancient building stock.
But you can even do it in individual units and individual buildings. Right. I mean, individual apartments.
So, Bob, do you want to throw in, like, how do these things get funded on a really massive scale, given that they would pay for themselves in many ways?
Yeah, I mean,
is there any mechanism that we can tap into there?
I can't really speak on behalf of a utility, but I mean, I know my own utility, and I think a lot of utilities out there do have programs where they're certainly happy to replace light bulbs and things like that, because there are costs to them too, and these things. And there's also I think a growing sense among the utilities and so on that they are looking to do good too. So by sponsoring these sorts of programs, instead of the public always hating the utility, and maybe they can actually get some goodwill out of doing these sorts of things too.
Well, we can hope.
Yeah.
Peggy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, there could be an Environmental Bond Act. If we had the political will, there could be a Climate and Energy Act that could begin to provide some of these retrofits. Again, it's about political will. It's about taking climate change seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's when voting comes in.
Okay, you're next. This lady here. Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation, working on a program called the Resilient Schools Consortium, and we're teaching middle and high school kids about climate science and also about how to build resilient schools and communities by installing green infrastructure and other things. So schools, as you know, are huge community hubs. There's 1.1 million school children in New York City, the largest school district, and then their families. Then children bring their learning home. We'd like to expand that kind of work in schools. Have you thought about using schools as places to disseminate information about cooling centers or about other ways that people can stay safe in the face of extreme heat and other challenges?
Yeah. Yes, we have thought about that.
Peggy, have you actually done anything about that? Do you work with schools?
We do work with students in schools around training around climate and energy, but it just made me remember that I'm wondering how many schools are not air conditioned. And as
most of them,
generally, school's out in June, which is when it used to get hot. But now if it's getting hot in May and kids are still in school for another 2 months, I don't know how many schools are not air conditioned, but
do we have
it's a
heat
considerable
days
amount.
in the same way that we have snow days for public school?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Maybe.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania they had some this year.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to take one more question, and you have to realize that this last question is all that is standing between you and the reception. Okay? So keep it short. This guy over here is kind of keen, so there we are. Let's do that.
It occurs to me that...
Oh, wait for the mic. Yeah.
It occurs to me that a lot of the solution mechanisms to reducing heat are kind of ways of redoping the climate, if you will. So I'm wondering if there are new environmental ethics that we could try to articulate around that.
Yes. I mean, we could get into geoengineering, we could get into, but I'm pretty sure that I would like to take that offline and have that be a conversation over a beverage of your choice. Do you agree? Yeah. Okay. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for coming and for the great questions and the great panel, and yeah.